On January 5, 1942, joyful cheers of victory filled the streets of Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto directed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to start planning the next phase of operations in the Pacific War. His analysis of the situation, reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and other southern areas showed that Japanese forces would soon control East Asia and additional locations they attacked in December. Yamamoto informed his Chief of Staff, Matome Ugaki, that he wanted the plans ready by mid-February. The rapid success of the Japanese in the Western Pacific surprised many planners in Tokyo and led to intense disagreements within the Imperial General Staff. The passionate military nationalists aimed to continue their advance for as long as they were victorious, regardless of the distance. In contrast, Admiral Yamamoto and his supporters were less enthusiastic about engaging in a war with the United States and Britain. They were concerned about the long-term consequences. Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato because friends in the Imperial General Staff feared for his safety if he remained in Tokyo due to his public stance against total war. His criticisms were not a secret to those close to him. Admiral Ugaki recorded in his diary the necessity for wise leadership after this initial month of remarkable triumphs. These were sentiments Yamamoto frequently expressed, cautioning that Japan could not sustain a war against the Western powers and expect to win in the long term. Yamamoto's blunt criticism of politicians targeted individuals like Prince Konoe, who seemed unclear about the type of war Japan should pursue in the Pacific. 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto met with his friend Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kakuzu-do organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto warned Sasakawa that war was unavoidable because of the decisions made by the politicians. He mentioned that initially they would have everything their way, expanding like an octopus and stretching out its tentacles. Yet now, just a month into the war, that octopus was nearly flattened. Yamamoto also cautioned his old friend that this sense of euphoria could not persist. He stated that the time for political maneuvering would come when Singapore fell, a disaster that would shake the British in India. They would surely be open to discussions of peace. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had been part of the delegations to the London naval conferences in 1930 and 1934. He was also familiar with the Americans, having served as the Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1938. Yamamoto agreed that once the politicians initiated war, a major victory was essential and needed to come quickly. However, he believed that after achieving that victory, Japan would only have 1.5 years to enjoy its success. He expressed the need to secure a peace agreement by that time. He turned to his old friend Sasakawa to relay this message to the right-wing political leaders in power. On January 5th, victory appeared to be within reach. The American battleship fleet had been rendered ineffective after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, the British battleships, Repulse and Prince of Wales, were sunk off the coast of Malaya. In the Philippines, Manila and the United States naval base at Cavite had been captured. The British surrendered in Hong Kong, and Japanese forces were en route to new landings in the Dutch East Indies, as well as in Rabaul on New Ireland, Amber, and the Solomon Islands. However, the attack on Pearl Harbor did not fulfill all of Yamamoto's expectations. The destruction of significant elements of the United States fleet did not happen, as the aircraft carriers that were at sea remained intact and posed an ongoing threat. What was needed was a spectacular victory. Yamamoto did not anticipate the fall of Singapore for another 5 or 6 months, which occurred on February 15th. He recognized that to achieve his goal of setting the stage for negotiations, he needed to take a different approach. The challenge for his team was determining where to strike next. The army dismissed Yamamoto's proposal to attack the Soviet Union. Such a war would be primarily land-based, while the army was already deeply engaged in China and Southeast Asia. 3 alternative plans were then proposed. Yamamoto's preferred option was to launch an attack in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, lure out the British Far Eastern Fleet, and destroy it, akin to how he had demolished the American ships at Pearl Harbor. His intent was to then advance into the Middle East to connect with the Germans, who were advancing towards the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. This would secure a steady supply of oil for the Japanese Navy. The army, however, rejected the idea of a Middle Eastern operation. Consequently, only two plans remained. One of these, put forward by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, advocated for an attack on Australia, aimed to deny the Americans a forward base after taking control of the Solomon Islands. The Navy planned to secure New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Supporters of this strategy at Imperial General Headquarters were already establishing systems for occupation in Australia and New Zealand. However, Yamamoto opposed the Australia plan. He believed it would take too long and would not deliver a striking enough result to deter the Americans. Yamamoto recognized that the attack on Pearl Harbor had incited a vengeful spirit in the Japanese, whom he had seen as soft and ineffective. The army considered them too weak to fight a decisive war. Even capturing Singapore would not stop the Americans. Yamamoto sought a victory that could allow Japan to extend a generous peace offering. In January, he demanded another plan. 2 months later, he sent officers to Tokyo with a document called the Me Plan. This plan foresaw a battle near Midway Island, where the American aircraft carrier fleet would be destroyed. He also sent the Ale Plan, outlining an invasion of the North American continent through Alaska. If all went according to plan, Hawaii would be occupied, and perhaps even the West Coast later. Victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would provide a foundation for political negotiations, which Yamamoto hoped to achieve in Tokyo. At the Navy Ministry, the admirals argued around the conference table, but ultimately Yamamoto prevailed. The significance of the fall of Singapore in February and the looming collapse of Bataan and Corregidor was forgotten. These events had once served Yamamoto's purpose. Their diminished importance stemmed from the April raid by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bomber squadron on Tokyo. The Doolittle raid shocked the Japanese into realizing that the Americans were only beginning to fight. After the disaster of the Midway operation in June, there was no time for blame. In fact, the army was unaware of the full extent of the defeat. News of the destruction of 4 major fleet carriers was kept secret, known only to the highest levels of the Navy. While Yamamoto was engaged in his Midway campaign, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo moved the Navy and its air forces steadily southward to prepare for the upcoming effort to cut off Australia. Naval forces captured Rabaul on January 23rd. From that moment, they carried out continuous air reconnaissance and bombing raids on other islands and New Guinea. The Australians quickly realized that the Japanese might strike New Guinea soon. They expressed their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur after he arrived in March. If the Japanese succeeded, taking northern Australia would be almost effortless for them. In February, the Japanese bombed Darwin. By March, when they invaded Salamaua, New Guinea, the tempo of attacks increased. In May, just before the Battle of Midway, the Japanese advanced an occupation force toward Port Moresby. However, the fierce defense by American and Australian forces repelled them during the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did manage to occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and established a seaplane base there. The Battle of the Coral Sea led officials in Washington and Australia to recognize the need to brace for a potential Japanese move in the south. MacArthur advised the Australian government to prepare for an expected attack before the Japanese were anticipated to strike at India. He reached out to General Marshall, requesting 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. Meanwhile, in Washington, Admiral Ernest J. King, the Chief of Naval Operations, notified General Marshall that, until the end of June, only 2 operational carriers would be available in the entire Pacific. On the eve of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had 10 carriers. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already provided advance notice about the significant action he anticipated from the Japanese, which turned out to be the Battle of Midway. While events unfolded at Midway, the Japanese were consolidating their forces in the New Guinea and Solomon Islands area. Major General Tamaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salawa, while naval troops occupied Lae and began constructing an airbase there. Independent of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had initiated plans for the Port Moresby operation. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hotaki was ordered to advance towards New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. He needed to be ready to continue the push against Port Moresby by July after the Midway battle. The expectation was that Admiral Yamamoto would return with his combined fleet to support this new offensive, despite the reported defeat at Midway being labelled a victory for the forces in the field. The Imperial General Headquarters did not change its plans shortly after the Battle of Midway. The Australians informed General Douglas MacArthur that the Japanese were prepared to act in light of their victory at Midway. In response, MacArthur recommended that the Allies conduct a preemptive strike in the area of New Britain and New Ireland. Following that, he suggested an assault on Rabaul, which was the key Japanese naval and air base in the region. This operation would involve 2 aircraft carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division. MacArthur aimed to push the Japanese back to Truk on June 12. General George Marshall presented MacArthur's plan to Admiral Ernest King with a few modifications. Marshall requested 3 aircraft carriers instead of 2, along with 1 Marine divisions for the assaults. Admiral King opposed this plan. He felt that it would place MacArthur in command of the operation. Additionally, King had other concerns. He believed that the aircraft carriers would be vulnerable to attacks from land-based forces and would not receive adequate protection. As events unfolded, the Navy faced these tactical challenges at Guadalcanal. King devised his own strategy. He proposed a drive from the New Hebrides, managed by naval forces. MacArthur objected to having his army forces operate under Navy command. However, the urgency of halting the Japanese advance, which could lead to an attack on Australia, could not be ignored. The main issue for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was who would lead the operation. They designated Phase 1 to focus on capturing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tolunga, and nearby positions for Admiral King. Guadalcanal was considered merely a dot on the map, lacking known tactical or strategic significance. In this Joint Chiefs of Staff plan, General MacArthur was assigned a secondary role. After Phase 1, he was to take over and eliminate the remaining Japanese forces in the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. Admiral King was allowed to proceed with his plan because the Joint Chiefs recognized that he had already established a defensive line across the Pacific to safeguard Australia. His plan required considerably fewer troops than what MacArthur had proposed. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, while King had arranged for General Henry Arnold to send several squadrons of United States Army Air Force planes there. King also reinforced Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides and intended to set up a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, who had frustrated King with his indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis, was reassigned to a newly established unit. At the Amphibious Training Command in San Diego, he and Marine Major General Holland Smith received instructions to create new strategies for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who was King's chief plans officer, suggested that their initial goal should be to defend the South Pacific while training the amphibious forces. The second phase would involve a joint offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and unmedicated ships by the Entabai and New Zealand, advancing through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third phase would include the capture of the Caroline and Marshall Islands. The final phase would take the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral King endorsed this plan. It aligned perfectly with his vision. He arranged to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to lead the South Pacific Command. King reassigned Rear Admiral Turner from the Plans Division and instructed him to prepare to take charge of the amphibious operations. All of this was set in motion even before the Japanese attack on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed from Washington on May 1st. He was to assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th. But first, he had to stop at Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley arrived at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive had already begun in the South Pacific. On May 22nd, an Army plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft capturing images of Guadalcanal. Army intelligence indicated that the Japanese were preparing to establish an airfield there. By June 25th, there were reports that the grass on the island's central plain had been burned, and tents were set up in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coastwatcher on Guadalcanal noted that the airfield construction was just waiting for Japanese engineering units to arrive. He even identified the names of the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, which were similar to American construction battalions. This information was validated through a radio interception by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The The Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence unit, which had deciphered portions of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message stating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would reach their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence connected the dots. Admiral Turner was visiting Pearl Harbor that day on his way to prepare for an amphibious landing in the South Pacific. While there, Admiral Nimitz received a radio intelligence report. Admiral Turner understood that he was headed to the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, he arrived in Wellington and boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, which was previously the Grace Line passenger ship, Santa Barbara. His mission was to train an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began to move ships and personnel, Admiral Gormley was en route to Melbourne to meet with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with doubts about the wisdom of attempting an amphibious operation when no one seemed to know how to execute it. MacArthur shared his concerns and agreed entirely with Gormley. They both realized that the available planes could not provide enough air coverage for the landing. This discussion took place on July 18th. With the landing set for 3 weeks later, they sent a dispatch back to Washington to recommend postponing the operation. However, Admiral King was not pleased with that suggestion. King had informed his new commander that he was assigning a challenging task, and the necessary resources might not be available until the fall. The answer was clear. The invasion would proceed as planned. Gormley had departed Washington convinced that the United States was unprepared for offensive action in the South Pacific. His concerns deepened when he struggled to secure the immediate dispatch of CBS and other units to New Zealand. From the outset, the planning for the Guadalcanal invasion was marked by failures in intelligence. All relevant commands were aware that an operation was imminent, especially after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley the operations orders. The primary Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Aircraft from that base could reach Guadalcanal, refuel, and then target Australia. Their capability to inflict significant damage on the Allied buildup was undeniable. But on July 10th, the intelligence report that reached King included only a brief mention of airfield construction at Guadalcanal. A few days later, a subsequent report mistakenly located the field on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield. Meanwhile, at the Combined Fleet headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto ordered that the first staged mission would depart Rabaul on August 14th. As the leader of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley struggled to secure more support for developing advanced bases. His goal was to bring in additional planes, but each time he reached out for assistance, he encountered the reality of Admiral King's warning. King had made it clear that Gormley would not receive the resources he needed. For instance, the supplies for the invasion forces were haphazardly loaded onto transports in Oakland. There were plenty of docks available, which could have facilitated the unloading and reloading of supplies based on their intended use. Instead, the ships headed to Numa, which lacked these necessary facilities. Admiral King had a general understanding of the challenges at hand, but time was not on their side. He understood better than anyone that stopping the Japanese advance before they reached Australia was crucial. The schedule was tight, and by late July, the urgency heightened. A total of 177,000 Marines were on the move by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Numa, and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too occupied to convene a meeting of his commanders. However, on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was meant to be in tactical command, organized a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. This gathering marked the first time the tactical unit commanders came together to discuss the invasion. Admiral Fletcher was tasked with protecting the landings at Guadalcanal, while Admiral Turner was responsible for delivering the troops, led by Marine General Alexander Vanda. Once the Marines secured the island, they planned to bring in garrison troops. Unfortunately, due to the hurried nature of the operation, no one had arranged for any reserve troops. There were no additional men available in the South Pacific. The atmosphere at the Saratoga meeting was tense. Fletcher began by stating he would only safeguard the landings at Guadalcanal for 2 days. He firmly insisted, with agreement from Gormley's staff, that the carriers must not be placed at risk. Fletcher felt jittery about the operation, believing it was rushed and likely destined for failure. Admiral Turner, who had a better grasp of the broader military context than anyone else in that room, criticized his superior. He pointed out that arguing over such matters was pointless since a decision had already been made to take the risk. Their duty was to follow orders. Fletcher should have understood this after the events at Coral Sea. Admiral King had been so frustrated with Fletcher's pattern of avoiding action that he had directed Admiral Nimitz to check on the situation. Fletcher possessed a fighting spirit that Admiral Nimitz appreciated. Nimitz was a kind man and liked Fletcher. He had given the carrier commander a motivational talk. When the Battle of Midway was won, Fletcher, as the commander, could hardly be criticized. However, just before the first American offensive operation, he warned the troops and the support ships that he would abandon them in 48 hours. This was not an encouraging start. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion took place on July 28th and lasted for 3 days. The training was held on Kororo Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to reach the shore. When they arrived, they were uncertain about what to do. General Vandergrift viewed the mock operation as a complete failure. There was no time to dwell on this, as on July 31st, the Marines returned to the transport ships, heading for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6, the task force of 75 ships approached the Solomon Islands. Admiral Fletcher nervously pulled away with his carriers. He planned to have his planes support the landing force, as promised, but took the 26 ships of the carrier group far from harm's way. American intelligence had faltered, allowing the Japanese to build up their airfield at Guadalcanal. Japanese intelligence, however, was even worse. As the United States invasion fleet assembled in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no idea an attack was imminent. In July 1942, the Japanese army was focused on capturing New Guinea as a base for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomaro H's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buona. After taking Buona, the Japanese planned to build airfields there as a precursor to an attack on Port Moresby. In July, Japanese air power concentrated on Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters flew over the area nearly every day after the landings. Japanese air forces supported the beachhead, especially in early August, as they focused on their new offensive. In response, the combined Australian and American Air Force conducted raids on the Japanese air bases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, Yamato, was anchored at Hashima in Japanese waters. He was leisurely getting ready for upcoming air operations over Australia and would decide on subsequent actions at that time. Groups stationed at Rabaul were returned to prepare for the Guadalcanal operations starting the following week. During the first week of August, the South Pacific skies were overcast, and only a few Japanese search planes ventured up. None discovered the American fleet heading toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese airmen flying from Rabaul were startled to see American carrier aircraft in the skies near Bua. They had been informed that United States carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed the carriers were working with Australian forces marching over the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or on the ground suspected an impending invasion. After 8 months of continuous victories, it was difficult for the Japanese to accept that the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion. If such an idea had been proposed, they would have agreed with General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid that an invasion had very little chance of success. Therefore, as the American Expeditionary Force approached Guadalcanal, it maintained the element of surprise. On the 4th and 5th of August, 75 ships moved forward under a cloudy sky. On the 6th of August, the fleet navigated through rain squalls for most of the day. However, when dawn broke on the 7th of August, the sky cleared, providing good visibility for the carrier planes' attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30, and at 6 o'clock the carriers launched their first strike. Planes from the USS Wasp, USS Saratoga, and USS Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, specifically at Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a causeway. The Japanese planes had remained grounded the day before due to poor weather. Admiral Frank J. Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft throughout the day, but it was unclear whether it was Japanese or a plane from General MacArthur's command. Ultimately, the Japanese were not alerted until 6:12 in the morning, when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base sent a desperate message announcing the attack. This radio message reached the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, as well as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Imperial headquarters. It was simple and to the point. enemy heavy bombardment in progress. With the weather cleared, the carrier planes departed into the scattered skies. Cumulus clouds floated under the light of a quarter moon as the fighters and bombers set off on their missions. 8 fighters, led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer, took off from the USS Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply depots. They found no aircraft or PT boats. Instead, they strafed the buildings at the airfield at Long Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the USS Enterprise patrolled the skies over the transport ships from 6 until 8, when they were replaced by others. Bombers began to target Tagi and the Long Point area, but there was no sign of enemy aircraft all morning. The Americans had the skies to themselves, and only operational accidents caused any damage to their planes. Planes from other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavatu. The surprise was total. The American planes arrived and started bombing and strafing the seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes, including the 014-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that all served as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots who tried to take off were shot down before getting airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavatu survived the attack. Other carrier planes targeted Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi, hitting locations on the beaches that the Marines would soon invade. Before dawn, the Marines on the transport ships spotted the high mountains of the island they aimed to capture. The transport slipped through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and the island of Savo into Soc Channel. As dawn broke, the guns of the escorting warships fired, lighting up the fleet. There was virtually no return fire. The bombardment from the cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troop ships ignited fires along the shore, with an oil dump exploding and sending flames into the sky. At 8 o'clock, after 2 hours of bombing and shelling the island, the landing craft started moving towards the northern shore, east of Long Point. The Marines were anxious. Neither they nor their officers had any real experience with such landings. This was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 o'clock, troops landed on Guadalcanal and faced no resistance, as the Japanese had fled into the hills. The advance was unexpectedly easy. The Marines soon realized how completely they had caught the enemy by surprise when they came across wooden barracks that had never been touched. They found a tent where they had slept. The breakfast table was full of platters and bowls. There was meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-filled rice bowls were scattered around. Chopsticks were hastily dropped on the table or lay on the straw mats of the floor. The condition of the tents revealed why the Japanese had left so quickly. Many were torn by shrapnel. Some had been flattened by the shelling from naval vessels before the landing. However, any Marine thinking of celebrating their easy initial successes was in for a surprise. The Japanese had been caught off guard on Guadalcanal. They had not yet established themselves or built permanent fortifications. Most of the Japanese forces present were construction troops, not seasoned fighters. On Tagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines faced strong resistance. About 250 Japanese soldiers were located on this island. They were part of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment, commanded by Captain Haseki Miyazaki. These Japanese soldiers were experienced and dedicated combatants. Edson's raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers selected from a force known for its fighting spirit. The idea of the Raider Battalion came from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, who had recommended the creation of a commando force. Carlson had served several months with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's raiders trained for many months under harsh conditions. By the time they reached Guadalcanal, they had already built a formidable reputation. As it turned out, they would rely on every tactic they knew and learn new ones. This invasion marked the first confrontation between highly trained American troops and experienced Japanese veterans since the war began in December. The Japanese had gained a reputation even more fearsome than that of the Raider battalions. They achieved this through their swift victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo celebrated its triumphs. Half the world began to believe the Japanese were unbeatable. The Imperial High Command was pleased to nurture this perception. Thus, Tulagi became the first real testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 in the morning on the northwestern part of the island. On a part of the island, the initial conditions did not seem much tougher than what had been faced on Guadalcanal. The Marines met some resistance from a few outposts. The northwest section of Taguig was dense with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea, known for its striking leaves and sharp thorns. Initially, the terrain appeared to be the main challenge. Edson lost only one man, and that was to a sniper. As the Marines landed on the beach, Edson intended to advance inland to a ridge that stretched along the island. He planned to clear the slopes as they moved south along that ridge. However, the challenging terrain caused the Marines to spend 3 hours cutting their way through just 1.5 miles of rising ground. After reaching the ridgeline, the Marines emerged from the jungle and encountered the central Japanese defences situated on the hillside. The Japanese had built dugouts and rock fortifications, positioning their machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. Their defense strategy aimed to keep the enemy below them. Yet, the Marines discovered that by crawling up the cliffs they could drop dynamite and grenades into the dugouts. This became the tactic they needed to use to progress. Once a dugout was blown up, it still posed danger. In one instance, the Americans eliminated 17 Japanese soldiers using dynamite. One Marine noticed a radio inside a dugout and attempted to retrieve it. Unfortunately, 2 Japanese soldiers were alive inside and shot him, along with another Marine who followed, before meeting their end. One section of Marines engaged in this defensive position located in the center of the island, while the center and left flank of Edson's force continued down the ridge. Even along the ridgeline, progress was not easy. One company experienced a 15% casualty rate that first afternoon. The frontal resistance was intense, but encountering Japanese snipers was an additional challenge. Snipers concealed themselves in trees, atop buildings, and behind rocks. Their tactic often involved allowing the forward element of a Marine unit to pass before opening fire, which typically resulted in their own death but not before inflicting several casualties. One lesson the first raiders learned that day was that the small-caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun bullets were more likely to wound than to kill, which was acceptable from the Japanese perspective. It took extra troops and resources to tend to the wounded during the afternoon. The raiders advanced along the ridge until they encountered a 3-sided ravine, which had an old British cricket field at its base. The Japanese had dug into the walls of the ravine and set up fields of fire that would become familiar in the months ahead. As the Marines moved forward, they faced crossfire. Colonel Edson decided to halt the advance as darkness fell. It was no time to be probing known dangers. That night, the Marines on Tulagi experienced something new. Aware that they were outnumbered and had no chance of survival, the Japanese staged a desperate counterattack, which would earn them infamy. They waited for the Marine perimeter to quiet. Then, at 10:30 p.m., they broke through between 2 companies and surrounded one of them. The Marines fought from their foxholes and in the open, relying on guns, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese advanced along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post, coming within 50 yards of him. Ultimately, the Marines managed to overpower the Japanese and push them back, but not before one company lost half of its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8, more troops landed on Tulagi, increasing their numbers to 7,500 on that side of Sear Channel. Edson's raiders and the men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines began moving once again toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they attacked the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep slopes of the old cricket ground. From one cave, they removed 35 dead Japanese, some already rotting, while others were killed in the final moments of defense. From this, the Americans correctly understood that the Japanese tactic was to hold their position until the last moment unless ordered to retreat. This reflected the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those who surrendered on Guadalcanal primarily belonged to labor battalions, not combat troops. On that second day, the raiders encountered numerous instances of a spirit they had not witnessed before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers, who, at the end, had only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines prepared for their final assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered the dugout, they found 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds before shooting his 2 companions and then himself. In those early days, the Marines were taken aback by the suicidal mindset of the Japanese soldiers. It was difficult for an American to grasp how wounded men, trapped with no hope of escape, would choose death over surrender. They knew the enemy had greater resources and numbers. It took time for the Marines to adjust. After witnessing a few Japanese pretend to surrender only to attack with weapons or explosives, the Marines learned to take the Japanese on their own terms. From then on, there were few attempts to persuade Japanese soldiers to give up. On the second day, American forces gained control of Tulagi. However, not all Japanese troops on the island were eliminated. For days, American soldiers faced harassment from Japanese snipers until the last one was neutralized. The stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi was evident through the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He had moved ahead of his men to assault a cave near the cricket field where Japanese soldiers had been firing intermittently. Sergeant Goss got close enough to throw hand grenades inside the cave. Marines were trained to pull the pin, count, and then listen for the explosion. After pulling the pin, he counted to 6, but the grenade was tossed back out. He had to duck to avoid the blast. After another similar encounter, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, counted to 4, 5, 6, and threw it again. Next, Sergeant Goss requested a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite typically used to demolish buildings. He primed the charge, then moved back. The Japanese threw the charge back out of the cave. When it detonated, rock shrapnel struck Goss's leg. The injury wasn't severe, but it was painful enough to anger him. He grabbed his submachine gun and rushed into the cave, firing as he went. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who had fallen earlier. Fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was even more intense than on Tulagi. The landings occurred mid-morning, with few troops deployed because expectations were low for Japanese presence. However, with the seaplane base located on these islands, the Japanese had fortified their positions, leading to considerable trouble for the Marines. The Japanese were caught off guard and were still reeling from the bombardment. The aerial attack had destroyed their seaplanes. The first troops landing were met with rifle fire only. But when the second wave of Marines reached the beach, the Japanese had organized about 500 yards back, and the fire was intense. The third wave came under fire before the landing craft could reach the shore, and the casualties were heavy. Gavutu and Tanambogo were dominated by small hills, not quite 150 feet high, but that was enough above sea level for their defenses. The Japanese had constructed fortifications along the slopes and were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. Just like on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be taken. They did not retreat, and the ferocity of the fighting on Tanambogo was almost unbelievable. In the early waves, the Marines landed tanks. The Japanese surged toward the Tanambogo dock, where the landings occurred. They jammed crowbars under the tank treads, threw grenades, and tried to set them on fire with rags soaked in gasoline. One tank commander opened the hatch and used the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers. But then one soldier scrambled up the side of the tank and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese soldier threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, and it caught fire. By mid-afternoon on that first day, it was clear that the Marines needed reinforcements. A unit that had landed earlier on Florid Island, where no Japanese were present, was called in to assist. Tanambogo had fallen, but the Marines could not secure the corridor linking the 2 small islands. The reinforcements were ordered to Tanambogo, and at dusk, they received 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unfortunately, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach, lighting it up as if it were noon. As the Marines advanced, the Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the sea. From the dugouts on the hills came a steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire. 2 boatloads of Marines made it to the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at the tiller. The boat swam around and headed back out to sea. The same happened with the following boats, as the crews believed there had been a change in orders. Thus, the men from the 2 boats were stranded ashore, with their only protection being the concrete pier. The Japanese opened fire as soon as the Americans returned fire. The Japanese spotted the position quickly due to the tracers, and soon several men were down. 1 boat retreated. The wounded were taken, and it took a while to clear the confusion before other boats began to land. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the unit leader, became separated from his boat. He and 5 men hid in the brush, and in the darkness, managed to escape and return to the beach after the Japanese withdrew to their hillside positions. Eventually, they were rescued, but it was 4 o'clock in the morning on August 8th before another unit landed and secured the causeway. At the start of the fighting, there were 500 Japanese on the connecting islets of Gutu and Tan Amogo. By the end, there were none. In the early morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station sent the first word of the United States assault to Rabaul. This astounding news reached the Rabaul airfield just as the pilots for the morning missions were preparing for another day of harassment of Australian forces on New Guinea. The orders were immediately cancelled, and all available planes were directed to strike the American invasion force. Before the planes could take off, they received the unwelcome news from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Afterward, contact with Tulagi was lost, which could only mean that the base had been overrun. At 8:30 in the morning, a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They were originally loaded for a strike against Australian forces on New Guinea, carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. A total of 180 fighters accompanied them as they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Bua Island, and then turned south along the coast of Bougainville. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they were spotted by 4 Enterprise planes. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet when they saw the large formation of Betty bombers, escorted by Zeros, just above Florida Island. The F-4Fs attacked, and Lieutenant V.P. Dias shot down 1 bomber, with 4 others smoking and noted as probable kills. However, after this initial strike, the Zeros joined the fight, causing the F-4Fs to retreat into cloud cover as instructed. They had suffered considerable losses. One of the F-4Fs was shot down, and Lieutenant Dace's aircraft was so badly damaged that he had to make an emergency landing on the Wasp. Meanwhile, Lieutenant G.E. Firebar led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise, and they found the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. 10 of them quickly engaged and attacked 3 enemy fighters. All 3 F-4F fighters were shot down. The other 3 American fighters targeted the bombers and shot down one of the Betty bombers. The first kill of a Zero was made by radio electrician T.W. Rhodes. However, the Zeros soon came after them in great numbers. The F-4Fs took cover in the clouds, but there were 10 Zeros pursuing them in 2 formations. They adhered to the Japanese rule of never letting a wingman out of sight. They attacked the F-4Fs from the starboard quarter. Lieutenant Firebar, enlisted pilot W.S.S. Stevenson Jr., and pilot machinist W. Warden were all shot down. One of the coast watchers spotted Firebar in the water near Santa Isabel Island. A coast watcher from Guadalcanal sent a canoe to rescue Warden off that same island, but Stevenson was not found. On the other carriers, the situation was similar. The bombers presented easier targets. 6 fighters from Flight 323 encountered enemy bombers off Longa Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist D. Runan destroyed 2 of the bombers single-handedly just after 2:30 in the afternoon. When Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their approach over the islands, the coast watchers were on high alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copra planter during peacetime, was stationed on Malab Hill on Banville, overlooking Buin. At 9 in the morning, he broadcast a message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles or about 2¼ hours away from their target when that message was relayed back to Pearl Harbor and then to the fleet. The message reached the invasion fleet with ample time for preparations. The reaction from HMAS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers, was indicative. When the announcement came, the boatswain's mate piped the message. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers, and all hands will pipe to dinner at 11 o'clock. The torpedo bombers arrived on schedule. The United States fighters climbed to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal, looking down on the invasion fleet at noon. The American carrier fighters and the guns of the ships were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were experiencing the impact of a counterattack. The American fighter planes proved quite effective against the twin-engine bombers of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal. All but one was shot down, and the only damage sustained in that initial assault was minimal. The destroyer Mug Buford was struck by a bomb while the enemy fighters were engaged. However, the situation changed when Pilot Officer Saro Sakai, Japan's top ace, was among the 18 selected for this long-range mission. The Japanese forces were surprised by F-4F Wildcats from the carriers. These American pilots dove straight for the bombers, choosing to ignore the Zeros. The Zeros did their best to protect the bombers, but eventually had to divert their attention to the American fighters. Sakai found the American tactics confusing. The Navy pilots attacked the Zeros, but if they missed their first attempt, they scattered and evaded. They had been well trained by their intelligence officers, who understood that the Zero had superior turning and climbing capabilities, as well as speed. After a fierce and skillful battle, Sakai managed to shoot down one F-4F and an SBD dive bomber, which itself took down 4 Zeros. Several other Japanese pilots achieved kills, but they lost 1-0 in the process. Sakai targeted a group of SBD torpedo bombers, mistakenly believing they were fighters. He flew directly into a hail of bullets from their rear gunners. His O was severely damaged, and he was wounded, yet he managed to fly back to Rabaul and land before collapsing from exhaustion. The Japanese still had a temporary edge with the quality of their Zeros. However, the Americans in their F-4Fs were beginning to learn how to exploit the Zeros' limitations. The fight for air control was clearly going to be intense. At that moment, the Americans enjoyed the advantage of being close to their carriers, while the Japanese had a numerical edge at Rabaul. The American effort faced serious challenges due to the Japanese Zeros' superiority over the American fighters. The carrier pilots were flying the F-4F Wildcat, which was slower and less maneuverable than the Zero. The Japanese could easily outmaneuver them. The F-4F's main advantage was its sturdy construction and armor, which helped keep the loss ratio relatively low for the Americans. The Japanese quickly recovered from the surprise of the American invasion. However, Japanese fighters faced the challenge of the 1,100-mile round trip. On the first day, Commander Nakajima, the leader of the fighter squadron, resisted demands from higher authorities for all available Zeros to be deployed. As the fight intensified, his most experienced pilots were engaged. However, more pilots would soon be sent, and the losses began to mount, mainly due to the great distances involved. By nightfall on the first day, the invasion by the United States appeared to be secure. American troops had positioned themselves near the airfield and faced little resistance. One prisoner revealed that there were about 600 combat troops stationed on the island along with 1,400 laborers. He noted that the enemy had retreated to the far side. Admiral Turner successfully landed 11,000 Marines, while piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies filled the beaches. General Vandergrift realized that the beach force couldn't manage the incoming supplies, but he felt relieved that they continued to arrive, especially since he feared the carriers might be forced to leave. He established a second beachhead, but it soon became as congested as the first. At 8:40 a.m., on August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers taking off from Cavite. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor relayed the broadcast to the ships. The carrier planes launched attacks, destroying many enemy bombers, but the United States ships did not escape without damage. A burning bomber crashed into the transport George F. Elliott, igniting a fire, while another dive bomber hit the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, the planes from the aircraft carrier Enterprise and other carriers began their missions in clear skies. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tonaro River, also targeting the airfield. Around 10 a.m., 3 fighters from the Enterprise spotted Japanese torpedo bombers flying low towards the transports. The Americans sprang into action with machinist Runan bringing down 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers, while Ensign J.D.D. Shoemaker took down another. That concluded the day's air activity. As night fell, the Enterprise's Fighting 6 recorded their losses, 6 pilots shot down by Japanese Zero fighters. The Japanese Zero still had the advantage in both experience and aircraft, but American pilots were starting to pick up important tactics. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group identified 2 significant weaknesses in the Zero: limited firepower and a lack of durability against damage. Due to the Zero's superior climbing ability, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, the F-4F pilots were advised to fly closely together. When they faced an attack, each pair of planes was to perform a scissors maneuver, continuously turning towards each other. This allowed the two F-4Fs to focus their firepower on the enemy while relying on their own aircraft to withstand significant damage. On the ground, the Marines faced fierce Japanese resistance on Tulagi, Gavatu, and Tanambogo. At Tulagi, they incurred 90 casualties but managed to take control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison, composed of 250 men, fought to the bitter end, with 200 killed, 3 surrendering, and the remainder swimming to Florida Island to continue their fight. At Gavutu and Tanambogo, the Marines faced 250 casualties as the entire Japanese garrison of 500 was wiped out. The intensity of the fighting at Tulagi sharply contrasted with the Marines' relatively easy progress on Guadalcanal. On the morning of August 8th, the Marines reached the edge of the airstrip they would name Henderson Field in honor of a flyer who was killed at Midway. They began to develop a sense of contempt for the enemy. One Marine expressed frustration, saying he wished the Japanese would come out and fight instead of running into the jungle. However, despite the seeming ease of the situation on the surface, officers were on edge. The second afternoon felt too simple. At sea, the Americans faced little opposition. A few Japanese patrol crafts and a couple of transports had been destroyed in the initial hours of the invasion from shelling and bombing. Only in the air did the Japanese pose a challenge, causing significant losses. Most of the early waves of bombers were destroyed, resulting in the loss of 21 out of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. While this loss was not severe by operational standards, it led Fletcher to believe that his decision to withdraw was appropriate. At 6 o'clock that evening, he requested Admiral Gormley to permit him to withdraw his carriers and acted before receiving a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's message, he realized that withdrawing the carriers would leave him without air support, as the number of Japanese planes was likely to increase sharply. As Fletcher began to withdraw, the Japanese were mobilizing in force. The word invasion had spread from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, prompting Vice Admiral Gichi Mawawa to act quickly. As the commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, he was responsible for all operations in the South Pacific. His first action was to load 6 small transports with troops and send them out, escorted by destroyers, to reinforce the 2,000-man garrison at Guadalcanal. However, the convoy encountered the American submarine S-38, which was operating out of Australia. Following the fall of the Philippines, the S-38 sank the transport Meo Maru, which had 342 men aboard. This sinking, along with reports of a large American invasion force, convinced Admiral Mawa that it was too risky to proceed with the reinforcement. He ordered the other 5 transports to turn back. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mawa had lucked out with his timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers left Cavite, located at the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 were headed northeast to Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, while 2 were bound for Rabaul. Shortly after noon, Admiral Mawawa ordered all 5 cruisers to make haste to Rabaul. Around noon, the cruiser Choai, with a destroyer, entered Simpson Harbour. The 4 other cruisers waited in St. George's Channel, positioned between New Ireland and New Britain, for the Choai to return. When she arrived late that afternoon, she brought Admiral Mawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. The Japanese were now advancing toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Mawa crafted his battle plan. By cutting their speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on the 8th of August. This would allow for a surprise night attack on the American forces at the beachhead. The Admiral was aware that the Americans had several aircraft carriers in the area, while he had none. A night attack would minimize the risk of interference from American planes, as the Americans had no proven track record in night aerial operations or any sort of night naval operations. This type of tactic had become a specialty for the Japanese. That afternoon's challenge was to approach Guadalcanal without revealing their presence too early. The plan required an attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders. However, if they could catch the enemy off guard, it would have a significant impact. The Admiral was unaware at that moment that the divided command structure, the shortcomings of American air intelligence, and the absence of clear search protocols would ultimately work to his advantage. The Americans relied on air searches and submarine reports for information about Japanese ship movements at Guadalcanal. Only under exceptional circumstances would the Coast Watch's reports prove useful regarding naval operations. Earlier that day, United States 17 bombers spotted cruisers as they made their way toward Rabaul. On the evening of the 7th of August, the S-38 monitored the Mawa force just after it exited St. George's Channel. The S-38's commander reported this to Brisbane, but American naval leaders did not take these reports seriously. Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's forward base, and it was typical for ships to come and go. The Americans had no evidence suggesting that these vessels were heading for Guadalcanal. Admiral Gawley was in charge of coordinating all elements of the American attack. To ensure effective air searches, he relied on multiple sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers from General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, both operating independently. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included several seaplane tenders and PBI patrol bombers. General MacArthur's aircraft were tasked with searching the Bismarck Islands, focusing on the large naval and air base at Rabaul. Meanwhile, McCain was responsible for monitoring the northern approaches to the area, including Truk and the Marshalls. It was expected that Admiral Fletcher's carrier aircraft would conduct short-range searches, but in reality, none were carried out. Fletcher was preoccupied with his concerns. Admiral Turner reviewed his charts and noted that the Japanese had a clear route to Guadalcanal. The path ran along the west coast of Banjul, down between Chazul Island and Vilela, past Columbangara, and between New Georgia and Santa Isabel. After that, they would navigate the waters between Florida Island and the north coast of Guadalcanal. This route was named the It was soon to become notorious in American naval history. On the morning of August 8th, 4 patrol bombers were scheduled to depart from Nundy. They would follow a triangular flight path with the apex near the Fiji Islands. Their route would lead them almost directly west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 patrol bombers would conduct search patterns from Espiritu Santo, flying northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands and ending at a point slightly above the Bismarck Archipelago, far to the west of the Japanese task force. 3 additional patrol bombers were set to search north of Guadalcanal. The night before, Admiral Turner reviewed the search plan for the next day. He noticed that the slot was left completely unguarded. He requested Admiral McCain to conduct a special search the following day. However, between Admiral Turner's flagship and Admiral McCain's headquarters, and then to the plane tender Mackinac at M, the message was lost. As a result, the search did not occur. Therefore, on August 8th, the Americans left the most obvious approach for any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal completely uncovered.